10 years ago, in 2009, I began my career as a civil rights attorney in New Orleans. It had been 4 years since Hurricane Katrina had devastated the city and the Gulf Coast region. Residents were still reeling from the aftershock of flooded schools, homes, and communities, and I was personally still reeling. The displacement caused by the storm was traumatizing, particularly for children. It's estimated that tens of thousands of children missed weeks, months, even years of school after Hurricane Katrina, and that the Katrina-era adolescents, as they were called, suffered such high levels of trauma and instability that learning became nearly impossible. Many children had challenges concentrating in schools, higher anxiety levels, and behavioral problems. And it was within this context that I began my work representing students with disabilities. In my role, I supported and defended school-age students with disabilities who were suspended, expelled, and arrested at school. Many of these students, most of them, were excluded from the classroom illegally. And prior to that work, I realized that I had a very narrow view of what it meant to advocate for students with disabilities. In my mind, I often thought only of physical impairments, but I soon realized that my work involved advocating for and helping others to see the ways in which disabilities were often invisible to most people. Many of the students that I worked with were navigating all types of challenges, learning disabilities, emotional impairments, post-traumatic stress. And what I learned from this work, both in practice and through data, was that Black students with disabilities, and in particular, Black girls with disabilities, were experiencing disproportionate rates of school pushout. In other words, they were more likely to experience exclusionary and punitive discipline than their white peers, often for the same behavior. Now, why do these disparities exist? The term intersectionality, coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, comes to mind, and it's at the heart of this. It refers to the ways in which Black women and girls are navigating the impact of racism, sexism, and ableism, and the ways in which these biases impact how they are understood and treated. And my early legal work with students with disabilities taught me about the impact of the school-to-prison pipeline, which refers to these practices of harsh and exclusionary discipline policies and the hyper-presence of police officers in schools that leads to school pushout. I want to focus our attention for a second on a couple of data points. So the first one here, the first slide here shows that 1.7 million students are in schools with cops but no counselors. 3 million students are in schools with cops but no nurses. 6 million students are in schools with cops but no school psychologists. 10 million students are in schools with cops but no social workers. And so in Pennsylvania, just to make this data a little bit more localized, let's look who's being arrested. In Pennsylvania, Black boys with disabilities, Latinx boys with disabilities, all students with disabilities, all Black students, both with and without students with disabilities, and Black girls with and without disabilities. We have a problem at the intersection of racism, gender, and disability. Now, most recently, the Pittsburgh Gender Equity Commission released a report. I'm sure many of you heard about this report. And one of the data points that I pulled up was that Pittsburgh refers more Black girls to the police than 99% of similar cities. Now, we don't have specific data from that study on disabilities, but we know because Black students with disabilities are overrepresented, we know that Black girls and Black boys are often overrepresented when it comes to school-based arrests. And so when we talk about access and inclusion for students with disabilities, these are the numbers. These are the lived experiences of students across the nation and right here at home in Pittsburgh. And they reveal sometimes that access and inclusion is not enough, that we must do more. Because if Black girls with disabilities, if Black students with disabilities are able to walk through the front door of the school with access, but are being let out of the back door in handcuffs, that's not access and that's not inclusion. We have to begin to examine how we are making our classrooms nurturing, loving, supportive for all students, and how we are addressing and checking our bias, racial, gender bias, wherever it exists, our bias against students with disabilities. Sometimes a facially neutral policy has a discriminatory impact, like school suspensions, like school-based arrests, because we know that students with disabilities are overrepresented in all of those categories. We must also begin to examine the impact of what it means to implement exclusionary discipline policies. What does this result in? It results in the countless hours of lost classroom time, disengagement from the school environment, feelings of alienation, and ultimately mass incarceration, as students who are arrested are more likely to be in the juvenile justice system. Now, in my current role as program officer for the Communities for Just School Fund, we're a national donor collaborative that supports grassroots organizations who are fighting for education justice across this country. I have the honor of supporting and working with parents and young people who are advocating for just and equitable schools. And I love their vision of what a just school looks like. Schools where there's a high ratio of social workers, counselors, schools that are trauma-informed and responsive, where the curriculum is culturally relevant and affirming, and where students with disabilities are nurtured, supported, and allowed to achieve their dreams, whatever they may be. Now, young people are depending on the adults in the room, the grown-ups, to see their strengths and their different abilities, and to affirm who they are and to validate them. And as Dr. Monique Morris says, who's author of Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls, she says that schools can be locations of healing. And I would extend that to say that schools and any location where we are charged with serving and supporting young people should be locations of healing. We owe it to our young people to make this possible. Thank you.